Welcome to the Connect Your Health to Life coaching podcast. I'm your host, Seth Lusk. I'm a master certified self-image coach and empowered health coach with a decade-long background working in the health and wellness industry. If you're anything like me or the clients that I work with, then you're probably struggling with body image, self-image, or confidence issues. You're probably also trying to figure out why it is that you have these amazing desires for living your healthiest and most fulfilling life, but you can't seem to create consistent actions in your life to reflect those desires. So join me as we dive in deep on what it means to live a fulfilled and authentic life. We're going to look from the perspective of an empowered mindset and uncover reasons why you might be what's holding yourself back from living your most fulfilling life. I'm going to break through some of the biggest illusions and myths that we've all been taught to believe along the way. And I'm so excited to have you with me on this journey. So my only question for you is, are you ready to start living your most authentic and fulfilling life once and for all? Then let's get started, shall we? Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. For those of you listening in for the first time, welcome, welcome. I will say it again this week. You picked a very interesting topic to join in on for the first time, or for those of you who've been listening in since the beginning for your 38th time this week. We're on episode number 38. Today we're talking about boundaries. And it's a very fascinating topic. I love talking about this with people, mainly because it's such a misunderstood topic. And that's why I want to talk about it, and why I'm always so interested in talking about it with people is because usually when I have this discussion with people, there are a lot of aha moments because they realize, so that's why boundaries haven't been working for me all this time, because I haven't actually been setting boundaries. So we're going to talk about that today. A few housekeeping things to get out of the way in the very beginning. Well, really not housekeeping, just some things I want to preface. If you hear some strange noises in the background, I have two things going on here. Number one, I've allowed my dog to stay in the room today while I'm doing the recording. Normally I don't leave him in the room. I'm trying it out this week to see what happens. He is a beagle, so he's super affectionate, but he's also very vocal. So if you hear some strange whimpering or groaning noises in the background, my beagle is in the room with me today while I'm doing this recording. He's very happy that I did not kick him out of the room. And the second thing is that our apartment building is being painted for the next month. And today, as I'm recording this podcast, I have some painters right outside my windows painting the outside of our apartment building. So you might hear them too. So strange noises possible in the background. Let's find out what happens. So today, boundaries. I want to talk about them with you because, like I said, they are so often misused and misunderstood. And what people think is them setting a boundary is not at all them setting a boundary. So, first thing I think would be great to discuss would be, what exactly is a boundary? So, boundaries are basically when you set up a very specific parameter in your life, either physically or emotionally. And this is the space that is yours and yours alone. And a boundary is saying what you will tolerate in that space, how you will act in that space and behave and think within that space. That is what a boundary is about. It is about discussing with yourself and being clear with yourself. This is my space. Either we're talking physically or emotionally. And this is what I will tolerate in this space, and this is how I will act and think within this space. That is a boundary, okay? Now, of course, we're going to talk a whole lot more about exactly how we set one, what it looks like, because I want to be very clear on that, and this is just a vague idea of what a boundary is. Now, how you go about setting it, that's going to be something different. Okay, so one thing that I also want to discuss is that there is a difference between having a boundary, setting a boundary, and having a boundary discussion or setting a boundary with another person. These are very different things. Most of us, when it comes to having a boundary, we kind of know what that is. Well, I think a lot of people kind of know vaguely what having a boundary is. And some of us have really clear boundaries of what we will tolerate or expose ourselves to in our life. And that is having a boundary. And I want to be clear on the fact that these boundaries are entirely our choice to set. I want to be clear about that because some people, when I begin to discuss with them about boundaries, it's like they have this idea that some boundaries have to be set. They're just a given in life, that everyone understands that that boundary exists and everyone has that boundary. And this is not true. Boundaries are something that are very personal and unique to the person that is setting them. Not everyone has the same boundaries. Not everyone knows your boundaries, or they are not assumed to be boundaries. So, and boundaries are not a must. Now, I will say that in order to have an authentic and fulfilling life, you will want to have boundaries in your life. But there's not a specific boundary that is a must for everybody. Okay? That's what I mean when I say that they're not a must. So boundaries and what your specific boundaries are that you will have, those are entirely your choice to set them. None are automatically assumed as having to have them, and they are voluntary. This is what having a boundary is when you have those in your life and they're very clear about what you will tolerate or expose yourself to in your life and how you will respond to those things coming into your life that you will not tolerate or expose yourself to. That is having a boundary. Okay. Now, in some cases, you may run into things in your life that are new experiences for you. Well, I hope you run into things in your life that are new experiences for you. If you're growing, that's going to happen in life. And when this happens, you may encounter some things that you will decide at this time, this is something that I don't want to expose myself to or tolerate in my life. And at that time, you will want to set a boundary for yourself. And remember, boundaries are again for you and how you will act in your space and what you will tolerate and not tolerate within the boundaries. Boundaries are not for other people. This is what setting a boundary is. So when we come across something in our life that's something that we recognize, I don't want to tolerate this in my life. This is not something I want to expose myself to in my life. And so this is where I want to set a boundary, and I'm going to, when this happens, this is what I will do. This is setting a boundary. Okay, so deciding that is setting a boundary. What most people call setting a boundary is that they tell someone else what their boundary is. Well, also they tend to tell them like what they should and shouldn't do. That is not setting a boundary. This is either emotional manipulation or the second example, or the example of telling someone your boundary. That's called having a boundary conversation. So having a boundary conversation is something different than setting a boundary. Okay, I want to be very, very clear about that. And we're going to talk today about what having a boundary conversation is like. The process of having one and when to have one. And we're also going to discuss this other thing about setting a boundary that is, what most people call setting a boundary is telling another person how they should show up and how that's emotional manipulation. That is also not setting a boundary. So having a boundary conversation is very different from setting a boundary. And I would encourage you that if you notice somewhere in your life that you have not set a boundary before, that you probably want to set this boundary for yourself in a non-emotional space after processing your emotions from the event in which you realized that you wanted a boundary. And only after this is done, the setting this boundary for yourself, should you then discuss it with another person. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit later in the episode about a situation in which you may be able to do this in the moment, but this is usually for someone who's very practiced in setting boundaries and is also very emotionally responsible and able to come from a very emotionally neutral space in an event when something they notice is, this isn't something I want to tolerate in my life. Boundaries need to be very clear and set before we discuss them with other people. And I'm going to explain why later. So I want to look now, because I think this is important to understand first before we discuss setting a boundary. Let's look at what boundaries are not. So, boundaries are not saying no. Okay, and I want to explain what I mean here. I know a lot of people that think if they tell someone no, that is setting a boundary. Okay? And saying no can be a boundary, but it is only a boundary when you say no and follow up with your appropriate and specified non-violent or non-threatening action. And we're going to talk about what that is later, how to set that. So this could be something like walking away, asking someone to leave your home, your room, your car, your office, or calling the police, etc. The list can go on about the different non-violent, non-threatening, appropriate specified actions. Which means that a boundary needs to be set before discussion takes place about that boundary. Because you need to be clear on what the boundary is and what your specified and appropriate action will be. Now, I will say that sometimes just saying no and walking away without any further explanation, that can be a boundary. The walking away being your appropriate and specified action, but it's only a boundary if this is something that you consistently follow through on. That you say no and walk away from these situations. Or after you say no and walk away, then you later set a boundary and then decide on what you want your appropriate action to be, which may still be walking away, or you may choose a different course of action. And we'll discuss again some appropriate courses of action that you can take. When this is done out of love and not emotional reactivity to anger, frustration, exasperation, or resentment, then this could be setting a boundary. When you're walking away, saying no and walking away to defend yourself, not against the other person. And we'll talk a little bit more about what self-defense is also a little bit later, and the difference between defense and an attack, or seeking revenge or retaliation. So sometimes saying no and walking away can be a way to set a boundary. But I would also suggest that you get very clear later, especially if this is something that wasn't a boundary that you were very clear on before, to go back and do that boundary work and set that boundary for yourself. When this happens, I will walk away because I do not want to tolerate this in my life. And then follow through on that action. If you don't follow through in the action, then it is not a boundary. It is not a boundary. Just saying no is not a boundary. It's only a boundary when you follow through on your appropriate action. If you say no and then don't follow through, then what you've done is basically just made an idle threat. That's what you've done. You haven't set a boundary. So I want to be clear about this because I see so many people being like, oh no, I set a boundary. I said no. But then they kept doing it. Well, what did you do after you said no? Did you follow your appropriate course of action, or did you just eventually give in and do what the person requested, or do some variation of it? Because that's not setting a boundary. Just saying no is not setting a boundary. Okay, so another thing that boundaries are not. Boundaries are not trying to get another person to change or behave in a certain way that you want them to. Okay? Boundaries are not threatening another person or trying to manipulate their behavior or retaliate against a behavior of theirs that you perceive as being wrong, bad, annoying, evil, inappropriate, whatever adjective you might be using to describe the behavior. So boundaries are not threatening the other person. Boundaries are not telling a person how they should behave around you. Okay? That is not setting a boundary. Telling another person how they should behave around you is not a boundary. That is emotional manipulation, or attempting to emotionally manipulate a person and control another person. That is not a boundary. Those are two very different things. And I see so many people, so many people telling another person how they should behave around them and then being like, oh, well, I set a boundary. I told this person they shouldn't do this around me. That's not setting a boundary. We'll talk a little bit more about what exactly is setting a boundary and how to do that, but that is not setting a boundary. That is trying to control another person. Boundaries are about you and what you will do, not the other person and what they do. Boundaries are never about the other person's behavior. Be very, very, very clear on that. I want to say it again. Boundaries are never, ever, ever about the other person's behavior. They are about you and what you will do. Okay? Another thing that boundaries are not is making requests for someone to do something around you. Again, this kind of goes back to telling someone that they shouldn't do something around you, making a request, I would like for you to do this around me, or I would like for you to do this. Instead of this, that is not setting a boundary. That is making a request of someone. And as a human being, they have the right to say no to that. If they say no to your request, they have not violated a boundary of yours. They have not disrespected a boundary of yours. They have said no to a request, which they are allowed to do. And you are also allowed to do. And if you had appropriate boundaries, you would be very comfortable with saying no to requests. A lot of people can't say no to requests because they're busy people pleasing and have no boundaries. So, boundaries are about how you will show up in your life when you are in certain situations or observing/interpreting certain behaviors around you that you do not want to or do not choose to tolerate or be exposed to. Okay? That is what a boundary is. So, why are boundaries so important? Boundaries are important because they allow us and our truth to be fully known by the people around us. Okay? Now, this does not mean that everybody will do what you want just because they know your truth and they know you fully. Okay? People still get to be them just like you get to fully be you. But having boundaries allows you to fully be you and all of your truth around other people. And it allows it to be known. Now, whether or not they choose to act a certain way around you, knowing that truth, that is up to them. That is entirely up to them, beyond your realm of control, beyond your boundary. Your boundary is about you and what you will do. Another reason boundaries are important is they allow everyone to be fully themselves. And by being fully themselves, we don't build up resentment, anger, or frustration or dishonesty in our relationships with other people. Everyone gets to be fully themselves when boundaries are clear and fully established in a healthy way. Another reason boundaries are important is that they allow you to be able to show up in your life in the way that you want to and you see is appropriate in your life, and allow you to start creating your most authentic and truthful life for you in a way that is truthful for you. So boundaries allow you to be able to do that and to be able to speak your truth and to be authentic and to show up in your life as you without having to feel like, or without feeling like you have to people please people or be dishonest or say yes to requests that you mean no to. Boundaries allow you to do this very clearly and very efficiently. Setting boundaries in the beginning of relationships is very important. And I know that a lot of you out there are stuck in people pleasing and you will avoid this. So let me tell you why not choosing to set boundaries at the beginning isn't serving you here. And I know you think that by not setting boundaries at the beginning, that what's going to happen is eventually there will be a time when it will either be easy to set the boundary or that it will just correct itself. This isn't going to happen. It's just going to become more difficult later. And here's why. When you do not set boundaries up front for yourself, and then therefore have these conversations with people that are violating those boundaries, you aren't doing this because you're afraid of what the other person will think of you for setting that boundary and for having that discussion with them. But guess what? That means that this person will keep on violating the boundary without even knowing that they are violating it, because they don't know that the boundary exists. And this is, again, why I say boundaries are always optional. Do not assume another person knows your boundaries or that they are just accepted. Okay, the boundaries are 100% optional and within your control of which ones you want to set and which ones you do not want to set, which ones are important for you, which ones are not. So what this means is that if a person is violating your boundaries and you're not setting the boundary and then having this discussion with them, and then remember, setting the boundary and having this discussion, it's not a boundary unless you follow through, then eventually it will lead to this person continuing to violate your boundaries, and this will create resentment, frustration. You will create resentment and frustration within yourself because you're not setting the boundary, and this person keeps violating it because you are letting them. They're actually not even violating your boundary. You don't have one. Okay? And so you will keep feeling frustrated and more resentful until you eventually blow up on this person. And then you're going to worry about what they think about you for blowing up on them. And then you're going to try and people please them even harder to make up for blowing up on them. Or you're going to feel forced to set a boundary at that point in time because they've violated it so many times over and over and over again. And some people, you guys will wait for years before you have a boundary discussion. And what I want to say is that when you get to that point where you feel forced to have that boundary conversation, this person has probably violated that boundary so many times that then you having that discussion and explaining it to this person is going to lead to a lot of very awkward feelings for you and this other person. Because you're going to have to explain to them that you've had this boundary the entire time, or that you haven't set this boundary firmly for yourself this entire time, but you've wanted to and you haven't because you've been afraid to set it for yourself and have this discussion with this person. So you've not allowed this person to know your boundary and for you to show up as fully you. So they haven't really known you this entire time. And now all of a sudden, you're telling them who you are. So you have to imagine this is going to be a big shock for this person. It's going to be a big shock, and it's going to feel very awkward for you and very uncomfortable for you and them. And the longer you wait, the more awkward and uncomfortable this will become. Imagine thinking you're friends with someone for 10 years and you always go over to their house and, you think it's okay to knock on the door and just walk in because the door's unlocked. You don't know that this is not acceptable. Maybe, when you were a kid, this was acceptable behavior to all of your neighbors and your family. You just knock on the door once to let the person know you're there, and then you walk in because you're a friend. You're not an intruder. So you may think that this is okay, but say for your friend, this is very not okay. And I know for a lot of us, this is not okay, but I'm just saying hypothetically speaking. And so you've been doing this for like 10 years, 7 to 10 years, and you thought you're this person's friend. And then 10 years down the road, this person decides to tell you, guess what? This entire time, I have not liked the fact that you have knocked on my door and walked in. This entire time, I have been very uncomfortable with that. I've been feeling very resentful because I haven't talked to you about it. I haven't set the boundary and I haven't had this discussion with you. I want you to imagine how you would feel hearing this from your friend. You're going to feel like you haven't known them for these 7 to 10 years, that they've been hiding themselves from you because they're afraid of you and afraid to let themselves be fully known and what they're comfortable with and what they're not comfortable with. So I just want you to see this, because what I want you to see is that waiting to have this discussion, waiting to set the boundary is not going to avoid it being uncomfortable. If anything, it will just be more difficult and uncomfortable to set the boundary later and to have this discussion. So I want to encourage you, if you have a boundary that you're thinking about setting, first of all, I would recommend talking to a coach about it and getting clear on what the boundary is and what your course of action will be. Have the discussion sooner rather than later. Don't delay it. Do not delay it. It doesn't get easier. It doesn't get better. And you're not doing yourself or the other person any favors by not letting your true self and your true boundaries be known. Okay? This person does not know you fully if you have not let your truth be known. And in order to have a fully healthy and open and respectful relationship, that needs to be done, okay? So have the conversation sooner rather than later. So with boundaries, I see a lot of people making errors when they go about setting boundaries for themselves. And so I want to talk about some of these errors that I see, or the mistakes that I see. First of all, people call setting a boundary standing up for themselves. Okay, so standing up for yourself is something very different from setting boundaries. And what I want to say is that actually standing up for yourself is very unnecessary. It's very unnecessary because standing up for yourself is usually code for retaliating out of frustration, anger, resentment because you haven't set boundaries, because you haven't taken responsibility in your life. So setting a boundary is not standing up for yourself. Standing up for yourself is typically a reaction to an emotion because you haven't been speaking your truth. You haven't been saying no where you want to say no. You've been saying yes where you meant to say no. And standing up for yourself is usually code for telling a person off, or telling them what they should not do around you or should do around you, and why what they've been doing is bad or wrong, and how they should be acting around you. Remember that setting a boundary is about you and your actions, not theirs. They will still get to be who they are and choose what they are going to do, even after you have set boundaries and had the discussion with them. Standing up for yourself, what you're doing is trying to get the other person to change something about how they behave or talk around you. or getting back at them because you have not said no where you meant no, and instead you've been saying yes, and you've allowed yourself to basically be a doormat for this person. And so you feel the need to stand up for yourself. That is standing up for yourself. That's not setting a boundary. And what I want to offer is that standing up for yourself is really never necessary. It's really never necessary. What we want to do is set appropriate and healthy boundaries, and to take emotional responsibility in our life. Okay, another mistake that I see people making is I see people setting boundaries to get back at someone for something that they did that they didn't like. So the person setting the boundary didn't like something that the other person was doing, and so they set the boundary as a reaction to that to get back at the person. And so usually the boundary is very manipulative. So it's usually something like, when you do this, I'm going to do this against you. So when I call you and you don't answer the phone, I'm going to therefore never answer your phone calls ever again, because I want to show you what it feels like to not have the phone be answered when you call someone. That's a retaliation, and that's not setting a boundary, okay? That's trying to get back at the other person and trying to manipulate them into answering your phone calls. You're trying to make them feel bad for not answering your phone call and trying to, quote unquote, show them what it feels like and hope that they feel just as bad as you did so that they'll stop doing it. That's what you're doing there. That's trying to change the other person's behavior. That's not a boundary. Okay, another mistake that I see people making is setting their appropriate action as being one of violence or anger. And this kind of goes back to the example that I just gave about I'm never going to answer your phone calls again to try and teach them a lesson. So if your appropriate action is something that's reactive to your emotions, then you're not choosing to own your emotions first and where they came from and to process them. And that then you can set a healthy boundary. So if you're setting the appropriate action as an act of retaliating against the other person or out of anger or violence, this is not setting a boundary. This is reacting and choosing disempowerment and emotional victimhood to another person. So always set the boundary once you've been able to own your own responsibility, emotional responsibility in the situation, and process your emotions, and then from a space of neutrality, set the healthy boundary. Okay. I also see people using boundaries as a way to try and manipulate other people's behavior. We talked about that. So using a boundary as a way to try and convince another person to act a certain way around them, that's not setting a boundary. I see people using boundaries as a way to tell other people how they should behave, so to basically morally shame other people, and to try and show them how they should be showing up in their own life and behaving in life. So this is not setting a boundary. I want to be clear about one thing, though. This does not mean that you cannot request for someone to behave a certain way around you. That's something completely different. The difference between a request and setting a boundary. So I want to be clear about that. I'm not saying that you cannot request for a person to behave a certain way around you or just in general, but they always have the right to say no, okay? That is not setting a boundary. Another mistake that I see people making is that they make boundaries that are not clear. And what I mean by that is, so if I say, for instance, my boundary is I will not tolerate people being mean in my life. Okay, well, being mean is a very subjective word. So I need to be very clear for myself what exactly the mean behavior is that I am not going to choose to tolerate or expose myself to. So maybe it's someone calling me a name. I will not tolerate that. Okay, but I want to be very clear, and it may even be a very specific name that you do not want to be called. So I will not tolerate being called the B word. But be very clear about the boundary. This is one mistake that I see people making all the time, is that they're very vague in how they set the boundary, which leaves things open to interpretation. And then in the moment, they don't know how they want to interpret their boundary, and then they don't follow through on their course of action, and then they don't have a boundary set anymore. What they have just done is made a vague suggestion to another person. or they've just made an idle threat. So that's a mistake that I see people making, is not being clear enough on their boundaries and their course of action. So I also see people suggesting a boundary that they want to set and then not following through on the appropriate action. And that is a huge, huge mistake, because guess what? If you do that, you don't have a boundary. This means you have not set a boundary. Again, all you've done is made an idle threat in that situation. So, again, if you don't follow through on the appropriate action, you have not set a boundary. So this is a mistake I see people making all the time, and I want to be clear about that. You have not set a boundary if you did not follow through on your course of action. So, next thing I want to discuss, when is it appropriate to have a boundary discussion? Because remember, we talked earlier, there's a difference between having a boundary, setting a boundary, and having a boundary discussion. So a boundary discussion is when we talk to another person about our boundaries and what we will do because of our boundaries. It is appropriate to have a boundary discussion with another person when you have a boundary already in place and someone has crossed over into that territory, or basically violated the boundary, and you have requested of the person to stop, or you've told them, I don't appreciate this, and they do it again. After a person has violated a boundary and you've said, hey, I don't want you to do this around me. I don't think it's appropriate. I don't like it when you do this. And then they continue doing it. That is a time that it is appropriate to have a boundary discussion. But here's what I want to say. Before you have this boundary discussion, I want to be very clear that you do not want to do this when you are angry or reactionary to an emotion. So if someone has just crossed a boundary or violated a boundary of yours, and you're wanting to take your appropriate course of action, I would say if the boundary is set and clear for you, take your appropriate course of action, either telling them to stop or leaving. And do not have the discussion with the person if you are emotionally reactive in the moment. Boundary discussions need to be had from a space of neutrality. Okay? This is something that if you're in a space of emotional reactivity, it's going to come out as being accusational. It's going to come out as being attacking. It's also going to disempower you because you haven't owned your responsibility in why you're feeling the emotion in the time and then allowed yourself to process the emotion. If you are able to do that, if you are able to process the emotion, separate what is happening from what it is that you're feeling, and not react to the emotion that you're feeling in the moment, and instead come from a space of emotional neutrality, then it is okay to have a boundary discussion. Okay? So we don't want to have the discussions when we are reacting to anger or frustration or annoyance, whatever it may be that you're feeling in the moment. If you are in a situation in which you feel emotionally reactive and you feel unsafe or uncomfortable, this does not mean that you cannot take your appropriate action of walking away or leaving the situation, or telling the person to stop. Now, again, if you tell the person to stop, that doesn't mean they actually have to stop. Okay? But this does not mean that you can't go ahead and take an appropriate course of action and walk away from the situation. Then set the boundary clearly with yourself. Know what the boundary is, know what the boundary violation is, and then have the discussion with the person later from a space of neutrality. Okay, so I want to be clear about that. There are certain situations where you might feel unsafe, and I'm not saying you cannot just walk away because you haven't had the boundary discussion yet. You can go ahead and take your appropriate course of action if you are already clear on what your boundary is and what your appropriate course of action is. So yes, you can go ahead and take your appropriate action if the boundary is already clear for you before you've had the discussion with the person. And this may lead to some confusion with the other person, and that's okay. That's okay. Follow through with your course of action, go to the space of neutrality, then have the discussion with the person later about, this is why I did this. I have a boundary here, and when you do this, I will do this. Okay? The point of this being that you do not want to have a boundary discussion in a situation in which you are panicked and reactive and you feel like you have to set the boundary or have to have the discussion right then in order to alleviate the emotional discomfort of either the fear, the anger, the resentment, the frustration, or the annoyance. This is not when we want to have the boundary discussion. Okay, because then at that point in time, you're doing it out of emotional reactivity. You haven't taken your emotional responsibility and allowed yourself to see why it is that you're actually feeling the way that you're feeling, what thoughts you're having that are creating those feelings, and then coming from a space of neutrality in which you can talk to the person openly and lovingly about, this is my boundary, and I have this boundary, and when you do this, I will do this from now on. This is my boundary. Okay? Again, it's not about the other person, it's about you and what you will do. Okay, so we've talked about when to have the boundary discussion with another person. And we've discussed how we have the boundary discussion with another person after we've set the boundary for ourselves. So a lot of you might be wondering, how do I go about setting a boundary for myself? I'm going to give you basically a vague outline of how to set a boundary for yourself. Now, this is not the details of how this will work specifically for you in your specific situations in life. So I would suggest working with a coach to discover your unique way of applying this outline into your situation and into your life. If you're familiar with setting boundaries, following this outline may be helpful for you, just to have a structure of how to do this. But so this is just a vague outline of how you want to go about setting a boundary for yourself. First, the first step is I want you to take the time to be really honest with yourself about the situation in which you are wanting to set a boundary. I want you to be able to get to a space where you are able to look at the entire situation without blaming or judging anything or anyone in it. Meaning none of the thoughts or the saying of that made me feel, or they made me feel, or they did this to me, or this did this to me. If these kinds of thoughts or words are involved, then you are not at the space yet where you have taken your emotional responsibility and you're able to come from a space where you are not blaming or judging. Okay, so you also want to make sure that there are no thoughts about the other person or thing being bad, annoying, evil, wrong, mean, etc., whatever adjectives you might put into that sentence. So the point of this step is that you take full emotional responsibility in the situation. You take the time to see the situation fully and take your full emotional responsibility. Statements like, when this person did this, I chose to feel this because I was having these thoughts. Or, I am choosing to not like or accept when a person does this around me. These are appropriate thoughts to have and appropriate ways to go about setting a boundary for yourself. When you can come from a space where you're able to talk to yourself like this, then we can move into setting a boundary for ourselves. So that's the first step, is getting to the space where you can look at the entire situation from emotional neutrality. No judgment, and there's no blaming going on. No victimhood, okay? The start of setting a boundary needs to be entirely about you, and that's what this step is about. It's about what you are willing to tolerate, and that is always a choice, okay? That is always a choice, and you need to be clear on that. That doesn't mean that you're not allowed to choose it or that you shouldn't choose it, but it is entirely your choice. So it needs to come from your genuine wants, and you need to be able to say, I do not want to tolerate this in my life. And that is my choice, and I like my choice, and I like my reason why I don't want to tolerate this in my life. Okay? So that needs to be your first step in setting a boundary, is being able to look at the situation in which you're wanting to set a boundary from that space. Okay, so the next step to setting a boundary is to get very clear on the behavior that is the boundary violation that you're wanting to clarify the boundary for or set the boundary for. Meaning when the other person or persons or thing did or said this specific thing, this is a boundary violation. So for instance, if you just say simply, I don't want to tolerate when another person is being mean, that's very vague. So I would say, specify, what is being mean? What specific mean action are you talking about? Is it calling you names? Is it calling you one specific name that you will not tolerate? Be very clear about that. Take the time to be very clear about that. You are important enough to take the time to establish this. So be very clear on what the behavior is that you're wanting to set the boundary for. It is important to be very specific and very clear on what this is to be able to set the boundary. Okay, so for instance, I cannot say when I say that I've set a boundary, when you yell at me, I will leave. Or when you're mean to me, I will leave. Because the other person may not recognize what you are considering mean. Okay, so you may need to say something to yourself and then therefore to the other person to be very specific about what it is that you are perceiving as being mean, so that you can say, when you do this, I will do this. This is when we have the boundary discussion, but that comes later. So in order to be able to set this boundary and to have the boundary and to honor that boundary and to therefore be able to have this boundary discussion with other people, you need to be able to be very specific about the behavior that you are not tolerating, okay? What you will not expose yourself to. Okay, the next step in setting your boundary is identifying your appropriate, non-threatening, stated course of action. What this means is what you will do when the behavior is exhibited around you that you will not tolerate. So you want to be very clear on what you will do in those situations. When you do this, or when this happens, I will do this. So the I will do this part is what we're talking about. This is your stated, appropriate and non-threatening, non-violent course of action. Okay, so when I say this, what I mean is this. Okay, if someone is hitting you, your appropriate course of action is not hitting them back. If they are cursing at you, it is not cursing at them back, okay? So I want to be very clear when we are setting our appropriate course of action, that our appropriate course of action is not a retaliatory sort of action, okay? It is not revenge. It is not getting even, okay? Our appropriate course of action is something that we are doing for ourselves to defend our boundary. If you do something back to the person that is what they just did to you to violate your boundary, then you've actually just violated your own boundary. Okay? So when we set our appropriate course of action, it cannot be what the other person is doing to us to violate our boundary. Otherwise, we are violating our own boundary because we're not respecting that boundary. We're saying it's not okay for me to tolerate this in my life, but you should tolerate this in your life. Or it's not okay for me to tolerate this in my life, and therefore I'm going to teach you a lesson and I'm going to do it to you to show you something. That is not setting a boundary. Again, that's retaliating. That's emotional manipulation. That is not setting a boundary. So your appropriate course of action, it's not going to be what the other person is already doing to you, okay? Now, I want to say that in the situation where there may be, say, some physical violence, this is not to say that you cannot defend yourself. But what I want to be very clear on here is that self-defense is very different from taking retaliatory action. Self-defense is about removing danger. It's not about getting even. It's not about teaching a lesson. It's not about getting back. It's not about taking revenge. Self-defense is about removing the danger. So if this is a situation in which there is violence, that doesn't mean if someone slaps you, you slap them back. But say there's a situation of violence in which someone is hitting you and they're holding on to you and you cannot get away, or they're laying on you or holding you down or something, then it is appropriate to take self-defense actions to remove the danger, which may mean that you have to put your hands on the person to remove them from your body so that you can walk away, or so that you can call the police, so that you can then take your appropriate course of action. But hitting the person back to get even with them so you feel better or to take revenge, that is not your appropriate course of action, and that is not self-defense. So I want to be very clear here. I'm not saying that in a situation of violence where you're setting a boundary that you're not allowed to defend yourself. I'm not saying that. But the defense is not your appropriate course of action. That is removing the danger so you can take your appropriate course of action. Your appropriate course of action is never one of violence or threatening. Okay? It's never one of getting even with the other person. So, say for instance, if someone is holding me down and hitting me, I may have to put my hands on the person to get them off of me, to get away and get to a room where I can close the door and call the police. If my appropriate course of action was, when you hit me, I will call the police. Okay? So that is the situation in which me putting my hands on another person, which may be perceived as being violent for the other person because I put my hands on them, it is appropriate to do that to remove the danger so that I can then get away and do my appropriate course of action. So I want to be clear that I'm not saying that you cannot defend yourself if you're in a situation of violence in which you're wanting to set a boundary. What I'm saying is if you're in a situation where someone slaps you across the face, your appropriate course of action is not to slap them back. If someone punches you, your appropriate course of action is not to punch them back. Okay? So, your appropriate course of action. Set it. Make sure it is simply to defend your boundary, not to retaliate. So let me give you some examples of what some appropriate course of actions might look like. And this is not an exhaustive list, so the list can go on quite a bit. It could be, I will walk away. I will call the police and let them handle this situation. I will ask you to leave my home. I will not answer the door. I will lock the door. I will not answer the phone. I will hang up the phone. I will no longer respond. I will stop talking. I will not come back. These are all examples of appropriate courses of action and that are nonviolent and that are not retaliatory, okay? But let me be clear about something. When setting this, you have to be willing to follow through on your course of action, or you are not respecting the boundary and therefore the boundary has not been set. Okay, the boundary has not been set if you are not willing to follow through on your course of action. I want to be very clear about that. So if you set the boundary as, if you hit me, I will not come back. If you call me this name, I will stop talking to you. You have to be willing to stop talking. You have to be willing to not come back. If the person calls you this name, and then they say something and then you start responding again, you've now violated your own boundary. You have to be willing to stop talking. I will stop talking. And you have to be willing to follow through on that course of action. I will not come back. You have to be willing to leave and not come back. If you come back, you do not have a boundary anymore. If you keep talking, you do not have a boundary anymore. Actually, you never did. It's only a boundary once you follow through on your course of action, your stated course of action that was decided on ahead of time. Okay? Then you have a boundary. So I want to be very clear about that. If you have to set your appropriate course of action being something that you will do. Otherwise, you do not have a boundary. Because again, a boundary is about what you will do, not what the other person should do, or what you're trying to get them to do. So, set your appropriate course of action and do it in a way that is about defending your boundary, not about threatening the other person, not about trying to get them to do something, behave a certain way, and it's not about getting back at them. It's not about taking revenge. It is an action that you have an agreement with yourself that you will take ahead of time, okay? So that is setting your appropriate course of action. Okay, so then and only then can you know that you have a boundary set and can you consider having a boundary conversation with someone. So the next step would be, if this person violates your boundary and you tell them to stop, the next step would be then you can have your boundary conversation. In the way that we discussed earlier, in the neutral, loving, clear, and open way. Okay? You are expressing this for you. Because remember, the boundary is for you. And you are expressing what you will do. Not for them and what they should do. So after you've set your boundary, after you've, come from the space of neutrality, after you have decided on what the behavior is exactly that you want to set the boundary for, and after you have decided on your appropriate course of action that you will follow through on, then you have a boundary, and then it is appropriate to have a boundary discussion with someone. I want to go back and stress this point very clearly here, and I want to discuss this a little bit further. for that last step. The last step, after you've had the boundary discussion, is to follow through on your course of action. My friends, I want to be so clear about this, so crystal clear. Let this be crystal clear for you, please. If you do not follow through with exactly what you stated was your appropriate course of action, when the boundary is violated, you do not have a boundary. Okay? If you do not follow through, then you did not set a boundary, and the boundary discussion is completely invalidated because you didn't have a boundary. So you can't have a boundary discussion if you don't have a boundary. So if you do not follow through, you don't have a boundary. This is one of the biggest reasons why I see people not setting boundaries, is because they're afraid of following through on their appropriate course of action that they decide on. And they're doing this because they're afraid of the other person knowing their truth and knowing their boundary, because they're afraid of what the other person will think of them. My friends, this is people-pleasing. This is people-pleasing. This is you people-pleasing a person. And remember, people-pleasing is dishonesty. So not setting a boundary simply because you don't want someone else to think that you are mean or that you're acting in a way that they don't like, this is you acting in a very dishonest way, in an attempt to manipulate the other person's way of thinking about you, or to not think certain things about you. And I see so many people who are doing this. So many people who are showing up in their lives and taking on this role of being this sweet, serving, giving person, but on the inside they are just like full and over, like almost about to burst with anger and resentment and frustration. And it usually shows up in their health and how they're taking care of themselves. And they eat their frustrations. They eat their inability to say no to people. Well, not their inability, their unwillingness to say no to people. And it shows up in so many ways on the inside with so much anger, so much resentment, so much disgust, so much really horrible negative energy in a person, because they're not willing to set boundaries, because they don't want to follow through, because they're afraid of what the other person will think about them. And so they're just out there trying to people please people and showing up and saying, oh, yes, I would love to do that, when really they want to say no. And then not having boundaries because they're not willing to say no, and then follow through on their course of action. And what I want to say is that I see so many people doing this, lying and then being filled with resentment, hate, anger, and frustration towards the people that they offered their help to when they really wanted to say no. And then after the anger and the resentment gets so big that they feel like they just can't stand it anymore, that's when they'll be like, oh, I'm going to stand up for myself and I'm going to set a boundary. Which brings me back to the part of setting a boundary, is to remember that setting a boundary is done from a space of neutrality. It's not done from a space of resentment and anger. If you're doing it from a space of resentment and anger, what you are doing is retaliating. You are not setting a boundary. You're trying to get even. You're trying to stand up for yourself, which you won't have to do. Standing up for yourself is completely unnecessary if you set boundaries for yourself. Setting boundaries is what makes it so we don't have to be a doormat and then feel like we have to stand up to people for stepping all over us. We don't get stepped on if we have clear boundaries. We don't get stepped on. If you are being stepped on and feel like you need to stand up for yourself, it's because you have laid down in this person's way. You have either said yes when you meant no, or you didn't say no when you meant no, and that's the same as saying yes, because you end up doing exactly what it is that you wanted to say no to. So I want to be very clear about that. With people pleasing, this is what happens. When we choose to act in people pleasing, people don't know our boundaries, and we end up building this frustration, this resentment, this horrible energy inside ourselves. And then the things that you are doing that you think are serving and helping other people are being done with this terrible energy, and you build up so much resentment for this person, and they have no clue because you have not been honest with them. And so you build up distance in your emotional relationship with this person, and they have no clue about it because you have not been honest with them. You are not serving this person in any way. You are not being kind to this person in any way by doing that. You are lying to this person. Let's be honest about that. We're not judging, but let's be honest about that. That is lying. And that does not serve anybody. And I know so many of you out there think that people pleasing is this nice, innocent behavior, but it is lying. It is dishonesty at its finest. out of fear of what another person will think about you. So you are lying and trying to emotionally manipulate people. I want you to be very clear and honest with yourself about that with this people-pleasing thing. If you're not setting boundaries because you're afraid of what another person will think of you, you are people-pleasing. You are lying. You are manipulating. You're not being sweet and kind to these people. Don't lie to yourself and convince yourself that that is what you are doing. You are not doing that. You're not respecting yourself, and you're not speaking your truth. That is what's really going on here. And I want you to be very clear about that with yourself, okay? So, inevitably, whenever I talk about setting boundaries with people, and we get very clear on what setting a boundary is, and we get very clear on what having a boundary discussion is about, and why following through on your appropriate course of action is essential for you having a boundary, and if you don't have a boundary. Inevitably, I always have people ask me this question, so I want to discuss this really quick because I think it's important. It's a very important question to, I think, be clarified because I think a lot of people have it. So the question is this: what do I do when someone does not respect my boundary? Or what do I do when someone disrespects my boundary or doesn't honor my boundary? And what I want to say is this, and you might not like this, you might not laugh at me. It's not their responsibility to respect your boundary. It's not their responsibility to honor your boundary. Boundaries, remember, they are about you. It is only your boundary. So the only person that has to respect that boundary is you. The only person's job it is to respect that boundary is yours. So the only person that can disrespect it is you. By not stating it, by not being clear on it, and by not following through on your course of action that was stated with the boundary. That is how a boundary gets disrespected. If another person does something that is a boundary violation or crosses the boundary, they have not disrespected your boundary. They are just being them. And boundaries are there for you to be able to be you while the other person is fully them. They are not about controlling what the other person does. And I want to be very clear about that. If you are asking, what do you do when another person disrespects your boundaries? I want you to really look at your boundaries and look at them honestly and ask, are your boundaries about trying to control the people around you? Because if they are, that is not a boundary. That is you trying to control other people. Boundaries are about you and what you will do and allowing the other person to fully be them. So if my boundary is, I will not tolerate someone cursing at me, that does not mean that anyone in my life should not or cannot curse around me. If they do, they have not disrespected my boundary. They are just being them and cursing. It is my boundary that I will not allow that in my life. I will not tolerate that. I will not be around that. I will not expose myself to it. So I will take my appropriate action to remove myself from that and defend myself and my life from that, which may mean either if they're in my home, I ask them to leave or I leave, whatever my appropriate course of action is. But that is respecting the boundary, is taking that course of action. If I don't take that course of action, I have disrespected the boundary. The other person does not disrespect the boundary by doing something that violates the boundary. That is just them being them. And this is the beauty of boundaries, is it allows us to show up in each other's lives fully being ourselves, and the other person is responsible for respecting their boundaries and taking their course of action if something that we are doing by being fully ourselves violates one of their boundaries. I curse. I do. And I have people in my life that don't like cursing. I have family members that don't like cursing. That does not mean that I will not curse around them. They have boundaries, or they might think that they have boundaries surrounding me cursing around them. If I curse around them, it is their job to respect their boundary and take their appropriate course of action. If I'm in their home, that is their appropriate course of action to ask me to leave. If they are in my home, it is their appropriate course of action to leave. But that does not mean that I don't get to cuss around them. I cuss. That's me. That's who I am. That's what I want to do. That is who I will be. That is me being fully me. If someone around me doesn't want me to cuss and they set that boundary and they say, hey, Seth, if you curse around me, I will ask you to stop. They can ask me to stop. My response will be, I probably won't. And I'm allowed to do that. Now, their appropriate course of action can be, then I will leave. That is okay. I can still fully be me, and I can still cuss. They can still fully be them and leave when I cuss. This is what boundaries are about. It is about us being able to be fully ourselves in our lives and follow our boundaries, follow our appropriate courses of action, and to allow other people to fully be them. This is what boundaries are about. So no one can disrespect your boundary but you. Now, I want to offer one last thing here before we go. We've discussed what boundaries are and what they're not, how to set one, how to have a boundary conversation. So I want to offer this one last thing. I know that setting boundaries can feel very scary. It can feel very uncomfortable. It can feel icky. It can feel hard. This is okay. This is okay. It's supposed to. This is not a counter indication to the fact that you should or should not set a boundary. Okay? This discomfort is part of it. It's part of it. It's going to feel uncomfortable. This is a new thing. It's not a bad thing, and it's not an indicator that it's something that you don't want to do. This is true for all new practices. All new practices, everything new that we try in our life, it's going to feel uncomfortable the first time because we haven't done it before. So if you're someone who hasn't been setting boundaries in your life and you want to start doing it, yes, it's going to feel scary. It's going to feel hard. It's going to feel uncomfortable. Setting boundaries, especially with people that we have not been truthful about our boundaries with for a very long time, or we haven't been clear with ourselves about our boundaries with these people and then therefore followed through with the boundary and so therefore had a boundary. If we've been letting people walk all over us and not speaking our truth for a very long time, it can feel very scary to do that the first time. But what I want to offer you is, first of all, it's never going to get easier, and you are doing no favors to you or this other person by not speaking your truth. You are not doing them a favor by trying to emotionally manipulate them by not speaking your truth, by trying to manage their emotional experience by not saying something to them that you think that they might take it and mean something uncomfortable for them and that they might have an emotional response about that is bad for them or that they perceive as being bad. You trying to manage all of that for them and manipulate that for them by not speaking your truth is not doing you any favors, is not doing them any favors. What you are doing is being dishonest and lying, and you are building a huge gap, a huge space, a huge void of dishonesty between you and this person in your relationship. And the longer you keep doing this, the bigger that void gets. And the more uncomfortable it's going to feel for you to try and jump across it and start setting your boundaries. So I want to encourage you, don't wait on this. Don't say, oh yeah, that's something I should try. No, first of all, it's not something that you should try. It's something that you want to do. And it's not something that you want to keep waiting on wanting to do later and later when you feel like it's going to get easier. It will not get easier. Promise you that. The longer you're dishonest with a person in a relationship in your life, the bigger that void gets to try and explain the dishonesty and why you haven't been telling your truth and what your truth is. Okay? So I want to encourage you. It won't feel easy, but that is okay. And that doing this is the best thing that you can do for yourself or anyone around you, because eventually this dishonesty creates or causes relationships to evolve into being less close, less involved, less interactive, more reactive, emotionally reactive, because there's so much untruth between the two people that they feel like they cannot say to each other, that they just become so reactive to their emotions because they can't explain to the person what they're thinking and therefore why they're feeling what they're feeling and then therefore why they're reacting the way they're reacting. So, my friends, I want to encourage you, if setting boundaries sounds like something that you want to do, which it is something that you want to do, then I want to encourage you, do it now. Don't wait. Don't wait on it just because it feels uncomfortable and it feels scary. This is something that you want to do. It is so essential to the health of your life and to all relationships in your life. All relationships in your life, whether it be work, whether it be friends, whether it be romantic, whatever kind of relationships, family relationships, especially family relationships. Oh my God, I can't tell you how many times I've seen people let family relationships become so volatile and emotionally reactive and so dysfunctional and untruthful because they're afraid to speak their truth and set boundaries. My friends, it is so essential in having a healthy, constructive relationship with people to be able to set boundaries. Okay? So, setting boundaries and speaking your truth is allowing yourself to be the real you and allowing that to be known and allowing what people will like about you, what people will like about that, letting that be known so they can like that. What you're doing right now is presenting this false self to people and them trying to figure out how to like that and what not to like, and it's not even you. So by telling your truth, setting your boundaries, what you are doing is giving everyone the opportunity around you to be fully them and for you to be fully you and for everyone to figure out what they will and will not like about you and what you will not like about them. And that's okay. That's okay. This is part of being a human. It doesn't mean anything about anyone's worth or anyone's likability. What you like about someone else doesn't make them more likable. What you dislike about someone else doesn't make them less likable. What someone likes about you doesn't make you more likable. What someone dislikes about you doesn't make you more dislikable. What you like or don't like about someone else is about what you're able to like and dislike. It has nothing to do with the other person's likability. What someone else is able to like or dislike about you is about their ability to like and dislike, not about your likability. Okay? Be very clear about this. So telling your truth and setting your boundaries is allowing that to be known and allowing everyone the freedom to fully be themselves. And everyone is taking emotional responsibility. Everyone has their boundaries set and is taking their appropriate courses of action if a boundary violation occurs. And it's okay. Okay. Whew, that was a lot to talk about, my friends. And I know a lot of that may feel a little bit unclear. Maybe it feels a little bit uncomfortable. There might be a lot that you still want to discuss, questions that you have. Boundaries are very, very important for you in your life and in your relationships. So I want to encourage you to do it. I want to encourage you that if you're thinking about the fact that you want to do it, just do it, please. And I would suggest working with a coach. Okay? Working with a coach, especially if you've never done this before. Reach out and ask your questions. Leave your thoughts and comments about this topic because I want to open up this discussion. And if you're someone who's thinking about you want to do this and you need the support of a coach, I am here. I'm here to support you as your coach if you want to reach out to me. That's all you have to do is just reach out. All of my social media links and my website are listed in the show notes. So you can get in touch with me there. There are so many options for how you can reach out there on social media and on my website. You have my email address, phone number. You have instant messaging on Facebook and Instagram. All those ways to get in touch with me. There are tons of options. But my friends, I want to encourage you, take the step, reach out, ask for the help, ask your questions, leave your comments, whatever it is, however I can support you. It doesn't mean that you have to work with me necessarily as my client, but if you have questions, reach out. Leave your comments. Do it. Let's open up this discussion. Let's get this clear for you, how you can start setting healthy boundaries in your life because it is so crucial to the fulfillment and health of your life. And I know when we talk about health, we think it's about the body, but your life has a health too. And it's important to have healthy boundaries to have a healthy life. Okay? That is all I have for you all this week, my friends. May your boundaries be clear and empowering for the rest of this week and into the next week. May setting them be clear and empowering for you for the rest of this week and into the next week. I love you all, and until next week when we meet again, ciao. Hey, thank you for listening in this week. I hope you enjoyed the content of this episode. If you did, please subscribe or follow this podcast to receive the newest episodes every week as I bring them to you here on the Connect Your Health to Life coaching channel. Ratings, reviews, and comments are always appreciated. These allow me to know more of what my listeners would like in the podcast and allow for more people who may be searching for a podcast just like this one to find the Connect Your Health to Life coaching channel. If you would like more information about me and the work that I do with my clients one-on-one, then please visit my website at www.slch.ch. Again, that is www.slch.ch. You can also find me on social media on Instagram at SethLusk_coaching. Again, that is SethLusk_coaching. and on Facebook in my free Facebook group community called A Healthy Life Connection. We would love to have you in the group, and it's only 3 membership questions that you have to answer to join, and again, it's entirely free. And if you need any further information or just want to say hello, feel free to send me an email directly at slusk.health@slch.ch. Again, that is slusk.health@slch.ch. Thank you again so much for listening, and I look forward to our next time together. Ciao.